So, it's great to see everybody. Thank you for coming today. When the talk's over, we'll clear the chairs, because I think the paintings do look a lot better without the chairs. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about how to start the conversation, and I think there's two things. One, like Scott mentioned, Tim was my tutor at St Martin's, and I think that that's a big factor in this conversation for me, in that we've known each other a long time. We've known each other for 30 years, and then when I went to his studio, I found that it was a really nice studio visit, because we were just looking at the work for about an hour. I mean, there were words in between, but it was just like this sort of wine tasting sort of thing, where we were just like sort of pulling a painting and looking at it, like really looking at it for like 5-10 minutes, and then looking at another painting, and we did this for over an hour. But so I think that there's something about speaking about this work which makes it, in a weird way, it's one of the few paintings that I've seen for a while that I really don't want to say too much about, if that makes sense. And I mean that as a compliment, because it's almost like whatever I say, it's never really going to quite match all the things that are going on. But this being a talk, that might not work so well. So I thought I'll start with a kind of slightly left field sort of anecdote or question, and it is: can you tell us about the time that your dad interviewed Salvador Dali? Am I correct in thinking
you are correct? Yes, but that's about it. That's all I know is that he came back with a cactus that Dali had given him.
That's quite something.
Which lived for quite a long time in Durham, but it's no longer with us, and neither is my father, actually. So, and I don't really have many more details. He was certainly more interested in the kind of literary side of surrealism, and had a better take on surrealism than a lot of art movements, mainly because a lot of surrealism had that kind of literary connection, which it isn't the same for some other movements that I might feel closer to.
Because he was a French literature teacher.
Well, that was one of the things.
And the Japanese sort of teach, is that correct? And I've done
Well, he didn't teach Japanese. He learned Japanese during the war.
Right.
As part of a team of translators.
Right. But a kind of linguistics background, essentially.
Yeah, but also he did kind of cultural criticism and lots of things, actually. And terrifying amount of things.
Right.
Quite hard to measure up to.
And your mother, she was an art tutor.
Art school, Manchester Art School during the war.
Right, and she also did sort of theatre
design, yeah.
So, in a sense, it's one way to begin thinking about the paintings is the way in which they strangely combine elements from both, and that the paintings are like stages or the arenas where something unfolds, but there's also this kind of linguistic element going on with.
I suppose so. I'd never really thought of it like that. I mean, certainly, it's easier to kind of define the influence my mother had on my work than it is to define the influence my father had. I mean, in a very practical sense, my earliest memories of paint are actually being under a theatre stage in Durham, Durham City, where I grew up, and being where she was working, making theatre flats, and being surrounded by big buckets of liquid colour. I was maybe 4 or something like that. I mean, very much like that kind of de Kooning studios, like buckets and buckets everywhere of different colour. And I think that had a big impact on me. I can still remember it. And when I first started using oil paint these are acrylic, by the way, in around 78, I think, and used oil paint for maybe a decade after that. And the first smell of size, actually, glue size, brought that memory completely flooding back. And I hadn't actually, it had been years since I remembered it, and it kind of triggered this.
And I think the paintings, I mean, obviously we'll try and kind of go into them a little bit deeper, but it's interesting even talking about them in this way now, that we start to think about in terms of sort of memory and making and language, and I think they sort of seem to combine sort of some of those elements. And now you went to Durham, 78 to 82, so Newcastle, sorry.
Yeah.
Newcastle, 78 to 82. And...
no, 68.
68, sorry, wrong decade.
Yeah.
68, 72. Okay.
80, yeah.
And it shows you listening, sort of correct. So there's a painting that I wanted to ask you about. And before we go any further, actually, it's interesting to note that these paintings, they're not recent works, or they're fairly recent in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah.
But they're actually from 2008, so just to kind of create that context.
Yeah.
They're roughly 10 years old, and they
Crikey.
belong to a body of work which is about like what, maybe 15 of these in total, roughly.
Yeah.
Now, but the painting that I wanted to ask you about was a painting that I saw of yours, which you put up on Instagram recently.
Oh yeah.
And it's a picture that you did in 1970.
Mm-hmm.
You put up 2 or 3 pictures that you did in 1970.
Yeah, I found some photographs which I didn't even know existed, actually.
And the one picture that I was thinking of, it's just the strangest painting I've seen for a long time. And it's the only kind of painting that you make when you're like a painting student, where it's just kind of like slightly, just like all over the place, and it's just like really unique, let's just say. But there's a link I found between the one image that I'm thinking of and these paintings, in that you had this kind of weird sort of cosmic background, and then what seemed to be like a kind of mouth or object, depends how you read it. It was like it was like it could either be read as a mouth with jagged teeth, or a solid kind of weird sea creature.
Small painting.
Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting. That I looked at the painting for ages and I couldn't work out what it was, even though it was these 2 things.
I understand very clearly why that would interest you, actually, because of the anthropomorphization, if there is such a word, of an abstract image, which is something that's quite close to you, and the fact that it is ambiguous. Those paintings, I don't know, I'm not sure. It's quite complex explaining what happened to me at Newcastle. There is actually somebody here in the audience who was there with me, but I felt well, it was complicated. I was playing music anyway, so I already had a kind of divided kind of approach to things. And when it came to making art, I was making abstract paintings. I was also at the same time making very strange figurative drawings, and they didn't occupy the same worlds at all. And certainly in those days, pre-Richter, well, not pre-understanding of Richter, it was possible to have a practice which could include both of those elements as a real kind of authentic practice. And in fact, even to this day, I still find that aspect of Richter problematic. The fact that he can kind of work in both modes simultaneously. On the other hand, for me, I find it quite logical to kind of move from one to the other through a kind of passage of time. In relation to something like Diebenkorn or Guston, that makes quite a lot of sense to me. And I don't feel that what I do is a kind of is card-carrying abstraction. I'm interested in the kind of borderland between the two. I think the work of the last 20 or probably even 30 years is closer to abstraction than it is to figuration, but at the same time I think there are elements in it which don't kind of tally with a very orthodox abstractionist position.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's funny because when I was writing the essay for the publication, I think we had an email exchange where I was talking about them, whether they were abstract, and then it really felt like a sort of being back at school moment, because like, why you keep making the distinction? And then I thought, yes, it's true. They're not really about one or the other in that way, and they're almost like this complete experience in relationship to painting and what painting is today as a result of all these things. But I guess the one point where they were maybe one or the other a bit more was the show that I referred to in the 80s at the Chisenhale, where there were some paintings that were like distinctively in reference to landscape and some which were trying to take the idea of a motif, an abstract motif that existed within a space. And in some ways, these paintings then combine those sort of
I think really the way to characterise the last 20 years, I suppose it is that, or certainly since about 2002, maybe, is that it's an attempt to bring together elements of my work which I'd already used, but I'd always used them independently from one another, and to try and I nearly said crush them together. Certainly to kind of, there's a sort of sense of collision, I think, which I hope is one of the things that gives them a dynamic. The fact that there's a kind of play with illusionistic space, but it's at the same time it's kind of in conflict with other elements which are much more easily read as abstract motifs. So, the two, I would hope, are in a kind of constant state of flux, so that you can't actually rest. I mean, I think the eye can kind of rest on them, but I don't think the mind can, if that makes sense. And so it came to me after a period of about 6 months after I'd just done a residency in Dublin, where the painting had become very tight and complex, but also quite restricted. And then I didn't paint at all for 6 months because I started a very heavy-duty teaching job. And after that, it was I was at a loss as to how to jump back into painting, really. And so, in a sense, at the beginning of these paintings, it was quite relatively arbitrary. It was just, I've got all these different things that I've done over a period of whatever it is, 40 years, and let's see what happens if you push them all together, and what will emerge. Interestingly, when you were talking earlier about those photographs that I just found, there were actually 2 or 3 images there of paintings that I'd completely forgotten that I'd made, actually, and which it was quite a shock, because 2 of them had elements, kind of abstract landscape qualities that were almost not exactly like what I'm doing now, but quite terrifyingly close. Yeah,
I mean, there's like a link somehow.
Yeah, completely. And there's a sense with me with this work that I've come a kind of full circle from that period. But hopefully, when that happens, you've picked up other things on.
Yeah, and in a sense, the work that you're making now, like 2016, 17. Which began the conversation for exhibition. In some ways, it's continuation of these, and it would have been great to show it, but the door wasn't big enough. You know,
it's true.
But in some ways, it brought us to then.
Yeah.
Okay, because it's a big painting, so we'll go through the door. So we thought, well, what should we do instead? Yeah. So we I think in some ways it's a kind of nice accident that then thinking, okay, what shall we put together as an exhibition? And this is like, it's not a retrospective as such, but it's got a kind of retrospective element by taking two works from 10 years ago, and that kind of like succinctness of saying dual purpose, you know, which maybe you can tell something about.
Well, I just thought there were two kind of, you know, there's two polarities here. There's this single aperture combined with this vortex motif, which this is. And then these kind of multi-image broken horizon paintings are kind of two sides of the same coin, really. And because this gallery normally shows, has group shows with usually lots and lots of paintings, smaller paintings, I just thought it would make a nice change to, you know, go to the other extreme and show two very large paintings.
Yeah, and what it's actually done in some ways, what works quite well, is that quite sort of immersive experience that you have. And curiously, there's an exhibition at the moment, James Rosencliffe's exhibition.
Oh, is it?
In Germany. It's just opened last week.
Okay.
Yeah, Tate Modern. Yeah, big one. No, it's in Germany, the Ludwig Museum.
Okay.
And
in Cologne.
Somewhere. And it's called Painting as Experience, which I thought was quite an interesting title.
Yeah.
And it's actually a title that he came up with, or a concept that he'd been thinking about. So it's not like a title that the curators have decided. And only that in his case, it's the experience of being in the world of, you know, images and society and culture and, you know, Kennedy and spaghetti hoops and everything sort of, and you're like in this world, you know. Sort of. Whereas I wonder if we were to discuss this idea of immersion and painting as experience, and this is where it gets kind of then quite tricky to find the words that marry the paintings, but I just wonder whether you can say something about that.
I don't know really. It's something akin to maybe volume in music. You know, the difference between a live performance, maybe, you know, recording where you can actually turn things down. You know, in a smallish space with large paintings, kind of unavoidable, really. So, but I would hope it's not kind of forcing an experience on people. I don't think. So,
because when you were making the which, you know, you still make some of the wall paintings, and there's that difference of the paintings on a stretcher to the paintings directly on the wall. In some ways, they kind of link to that quite directly.
Yeah, I mean, they engage with architecture completely, so that the whole room is sort of taken over. But I suppose this is interesting because it's not quite that. You know, they're still independent paintings. They're still unique kind of objects. They're not. It's not site specific in that sense.
And you also talked about just creating a situation with the wall paintings rather than by liberating from the stretcher, that then it wouldn't be like a picture, but more like a situation where you, as a viewer, sort of find your own relationship or meanings to that situation. But that's it. I think because of the kind of intimacy of the space and the scale of the works, these kind of, they're almost like something in between the wall paintings and the actual painting.
I think so. I think what's interesting for me, or at least quite hard for me, is to work out how much of the meaning of the paintings is derives from that physical contact with them or physical experience of them, and how much of that is immaterial, is in the mind. That's something I'm not quite sure about, because I think the two kind of intermesh or intermingle in a way that makes it very hard to disentangle, your physical experience of the work from any other kinds of meanings that the paintings might have. In fact, the whole idea of meaning in painting, for me, is fascinating, but I don't really. Yeah. I'd be very hard pushed to try and define that. Certainly in terms of my own work, I think most painters might feel that almost.
So, are you in agreement with the sort of famous de Kooning sort of line about meaning being a glimpse? And
slipping, yes.
And he says, when I'm slipping, then it's good. I'm a slipping glimpser. So he talks about meaning being a glimpse, and I actually think that is true. It's very difficult sort of writing and talking about works in that sense, where there's almost a conflict in the way you mentioned once about how you title a painting or how you title a song, and you're actually setting up a conflict in a weird way by trying to create an equivalent to the thing.
The equivalence lies in the process of trying to relate a title to the painting, because it invites you to do it in a literal way, but then it becomes apparent that isn't possible. It's not like a title, when you get a topographical landscape and it tells you where it is, or you might, some abstract painters might, I think red shift number 1 or something like that. But I'm interested in trying to have titles which have a problematic relationship to the painting. In other words, it makes you wonder what that connection is, because at first there isn't an apparent connection. For me, usually the titles these days anyway come a lot later after the paintings. They used to come at the same time when the paintings took longer, but now they come later, and quite often it's through some kind of associative process that is very hard to pin down.
So, for example, Fire and Fleet and Wonderful on the Platform.
Well, okay. Damn. I talked myself into that. I told myself a little while ago that I would never explain my titles anymore. But because actually the working out of them is part of the process of, I think, trying to get to the paintings, or to derive meaning from the paintings. However, I've got to, now that you've asked me, I'll have to. Okay, Fire and Fleet is a line from a very old northern dirge called the Lightweight Dirge. And the Lightweight Walk is a stretch of moorland in North Yorkshire, where it was traditional to, when local people died, they were carried in a coffin across the moorland for something like 10 or 15 miles at night with a kind of candlelit procession, and they would sing this dirge as they went. And it's Fire and Fleet and Candle Lit and Christ Receive Thy Soul. It's actually quite an extraordinary ballad. And there is a recording of it by the Young Tradition, who probably nobody in this audience has ever heard of, who were unaccompanied traditional folk singers in the mid-60s. I saw a couple of times. Fantastic harmony singers. Anyway, that's the only... There are several recorded versions of it, but that's the best one. How that relates to that painting, though, is quite obscure. This painting is called One Foot on the Platform, and that's also a quote from a song. They're not all quotes from songs, but it just happens that these are. From The House of the Rising Sun, which I'm sure most people will have heard at some point or another. And One Foot on the Platform, the other on the train. So immediately there's a sense of duality and a kind of pulling part of polarities and extension of polarities. And if we push that even further, there's also in Zen Buddhism there's a very famous piece of writing called the Platform Sutra, which is a very profound text, but the platform in that case refers to the dais on which whoever the master would ascend and then deliver a sermon, or a sermon, maybe the wrong word, but talk. So there are other, so I suppose what I'm trying to, why I'm mentioning all of this is to show that the ingredients are kind of fairly complex, but also quite flexible. And hopefully how that kind of image marries up with what I've just told you is somewhat problematic. Is not necessarily a rational kind of thing.
Everything's been squashed together. The story, the idea of music, which is a big part of your life. I mean, you were a musician for 10 years in the band, which I'll ask you a few questions in a moment.
No, please don't.
so, language, music, Zen, Buddhism.
Well, there's lots of it. Everybody has a lot of ingredients, don't they? I think in their makeup, everybody.
Yeah.
But whether you choose to use all of those things, if you're an artist, is really a very personal thing. A lot of people don't. They kind of cut a lot away, to end up with something that's very minimal and focused. I guess I don't do that. I do the opposite. I suppose they're maximal, which I think also means that earlier on in my work, I think that was quite problematic in relation to people, for people, in looking at it. Because.
But even when you say things like sort of,
it's not very cool. It's not very.
It's like which is why I wanted to ask you about the Zen Buddhism bit, because. For many years, when I looked at your work, I remember thinking about almost like if there was something that I was trying to work out. What is it? How is it that I'm meant to look at them? Even though I've seen the paintings for a long time, and the only kind of like glimpse, that then I kind of suddenly got about trying to understand them was actually, well, not understand them, but engage with them, was to do more with these slightly transcendental ideas. Which is why the tone of my essay in the publication suddenly clicks that maybe there's something actually that I'd never really thought about in terms of your work, because there's elements which is quite Western abstraction tropes, but then there's also that kind of like substrate of maybe these ideas of Tibetan painting or Zen Buddhism, or you talk about the significance of the colour blue in relationship to infinity and things like that. And they're not necessarily things that often are in the fore, and maybe they don't need to be, or maybe it's difficult for them to be there. But
well, I think, as I said earlier, they're not kind of cool in kind of reserved sense at all. And normally I don't really I don't really like to talk about all of that, but we're here and we are talking about it, so but
I think it's something to do with like which is something that's recurred in this experience. It's this idea of like not one, like there's a contradiction in both the way that you address the word, you know, when you speak, and making, in that you're very specific about, you know, what it is,
mm-hmm.
but at the same time you don't want it to be pinned down.
Yeah.
Consider.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
You know. So.
I mean, I can't remember what was. Somebody wrote about my work, and the title of it was "Evasion Tactics." But you know, I don't feel I'm kind of evading anything. It's just that I'm kind of talking round it, because I suppose, you know, what I'm really aiming for is an experience which can't be wholly encompassed by verbal explanation, or in fact rational discourse. You know, I'm not saying that it excludes that at all, but it's very important for me that it goes beyond that. I would say. I think the phrase that keeps coming to mind is, you know, like I imagine you saying, well, it's complicated. You know, it's complex, or it's complex. Well, it's not simple. I suppose it just hasn't been very fashionable or accepted to discuss that kind of stuff in relation to painting or in relation to art for a very long time. But you know, there was a time in the 50s. You know, think of somebody like Franz Klein, who was in touch with calligraphers in Japan. There was, you know, a huge kind of, in America at that time, it's a very primitive understanding of Zen Buddhism, but it had a huge influence on the arts at that point.
Yeah.
You know, from people like Klein to people completely different, you know, like Cage, you know, that, you know, it was quite a big deal. And obviously I'm a lot younger than that, but I suppose I caught I kind of it's another childhood thing actually. I can remember seeing Suzuki's books on Zen. This is the D.T. Suzuki's books on Zen in my father's bookshelves, and kind of picking them, you know, no real understanding of it. Not that I have any more understanding now, but you know, but those things kind of go. They're in the mixture, really.
I mean, I think they relate to all those ideas, but actually they also for me they feel very much that they're also looking forward. You know, that they're not necessarily like about that kind of you know, glorification or you know, waving the sort of abstraction flag, but you know, you get a sense sometimes that, I mean, they make me think of like, you know, even sort of early Photoshop or something, or early kind of like if somebody was trying to work out the idea of an effect, you know, but it's like this, it's like you know, like say the printing press, you know, you had the printing press, and it was like this really kind of complex thing, but at the same time very archaic, and you know, you could only make, even with the printing press, you could only make so many books, and they feel like you were kind of toying also with this idea of how language has changed, visual language has changed. I mean, whether it's sort of magic eye, or you know, the way in which we have like a different relationship to the image now because of the sort of post-digital age. But these, that said, they're not like, say, do you know R.T. Vierkant, sort of American artist? And he's very much like post-internet, which is fully kind of like the whole thing's made in Photoshop and printed and then you know, made into a sculpture and then put on the website and then photographed again. They're not like that. They're paintings. Do you see what I mean? So they have a foot on those ideas, but they're also very much like saying no, but it's still to do with painting and still to do with like sort of making it sort of as a painting.
Yes, it is. I mean, you know, a lot of the time you worry that the paintings are carrying all these meanings that you are giving them. Maybe they're not, you know, maybe they have no meaning. I mean, you know, one of the relationships to what I've just been talking about in kind of Zen Buddhism is that one of the things I'm interested in the paintings doing is almost defeating ideation, or kind of pulling the rug out from them, so that at the same time as the paintings are creating a situation in which you're making associations, you're involving yourself formally with the work. At the same time, there are always things happening which deny that reading, or at least subvert that initial reading, so that continually that's being, it sets up questions as often as it's giving you answers. And I think that in itself has a meaning. You know, the fact that it's unraveling meaning has a meaning.
And when he says something like association, for example, even something like, say, the use of brushes that you have in your work, I find that they have, for me at least, they have multiple associations. So, you know, on the one hand, I think of, like, say, you know, de Kooning's brushes, and how he used to be like a painter and decorator, and he was very knowledgeable about brushes and the type of, like, sign writes of brushes that they would use, and all that business to make them sort of whatever. You know, so I think on the one hand about that, but then I also think about you know, sort of calligraphy, sort of brushy calligraphy. You know, and then I think about, like, this idea of, like, almost like trying to make this impossible brush, you know, or this kind of brushes that have never been made, because some of the brushes that you make sort of have never been made. They kind of been
they're just larger versions of things which have been made, actually.
But which you put together, or you sort of...
You're talking about graining brushes,
yes.
Which, for people who don't know, a graining brush is a craftsman's tool invented, I suppose, probably in the 18th century, maybe, for imitating wood grain. So it's like an orthodox brush, but with every other bristle missing, so it creates a hatched mark, which is exactly what you can see being used in these. And in the 80s, I first discovered them in the 80s, and at that point of the oil paintings, those landscape-orientated paintings, I was using all kinds of different tools, rags, brushes of all sorts, knives, and so on. And the graining brush, after I discovered it, just became one of those tools. And then there was a shift in 89 or late 89, 90, which also coincided with me returning to acrylic paint and using a graining brush. It's such a detail, really, but I just happened to, I've been having technical problems with the oil paintings in terms of grounds, so there was something going wrong with them, so paint developed cracks, which obviously wasn't a good thing, so I decided to revert to acrylic grounds, and I made an acrylic, a bright orange ground, which was fantastic after so long using kind of orthodox oil grounds, and I happened to pick up a graining brush. I thought we'd just kick off and see what happens, and took it across this bright blue across this bright orange ground, and stepped back from it and realised that I'd just finished a painting in about 5 minutes, and it took me a while to absorb the implications of that. And really, from then through till about 2000, that work was all done with the graining brush. And then after that, other things began to come back in again. So with these, the grounds are multifarious. They're all made with all sorts of different tools, just like, I suppose, the 80s paintings were. And the graining brush has reverted to being just one of, although, obviously a very major part of the paintings, it's still just, it's now one of many tools. So, and what I like about it is the fact that the paint is opaque, but because it's showing the ground through that hatched mark, it gives you a transparency, which obviously I just like that contradiction. You're creating transparency with opaque paint.
The other thing that I find or one of the things that I find that the graining brush does is that it kind of subverts that sort of idea of the brush mark being on top of the ground.
Yeah.
And because they're slightly transparent, then you get this kind of weird visual contradiction of like what is on top of what.
Yeah.
And it's almost like sort of interference, or the two elements sort of merging together into one thing, rather than a brush mark customarily being on top of a ground that you've sort of laid out.
Yeah, certainly that kind of spatial ambiguity is really crucial in the work, I think. Not just with the brushstrokes, but also with the kind of positioning of the vignettes, or whatever you want to call the holes. Are they holes or are they forms emerging? You know, they're both really. They're both.
They also.
There's a thing about weaving in there as well. You know.
Do you want to say something about weaving?
Well. What does it say about weaving's weaving, isn't it? It flashed on me recently, actually. I was just happened to see the page from the Book of Kells and realised this kind of looking at that Celtic, you know, the Lindisfarne Gospel is another one. This kind of interwoven, incredibly complex. So there's some of that in it, I guess. But that actually wasn't a conscious decision. It's just the way that these evolved, because in earlier days, the brushstrokes were much more regular and less broken. At the moment, though, I don't know if this says something about my state of mind. No, perhaps it does.
The graining brush also seems to exaggerate weirdly the idea of the brush mark. It's almost like it makes me think a little bit of like
Liechtenstein.
I was going to say when he does those kind of like almost like the most graphic brush mark in the world, which is also
what I find fascinating about that is that, unlike the Liechtenstein brush mark, which is a quote of a brush mark, and unlike, say, de Kooning, which is full-blooded, full-on brush mark, it's actually right in the middle. It's a quotation of a brush mark, but it's a brush mark at the same time. It's a genuine, brush mark. It's not
a
one step removed. The brush mark.
It is the brush mark, but it's just
which that's another layer. Yeah.
It's a bit like in music where you have in the early, again they're kind of they're sort of proto-digital in that they're not quite, they're still being made in an analog way, in the way that in the early days of sort of electronic music you had what's it called, musical instrument interface or something, device or something, and you'd have things to in some ways alter musical instruments. It was before electronic music became fully fledged, and they seem a little bit like that, in that you've done something to the brush mark. You've done something to the brush mark, but it's still a brush mark. It's not kind of a simulacrum of that.
Or like the radio, or what do they call it, Telstar tornadoes. Like that.
Now, of the two paintings here, it would be fair to say that maybe the more recent work, the one that's in the studio, the one that initiated the conversation, is more like this one of the two.
Yeah, it's a vortex painting.
With a kind of central motif. You've talked about it sometimes as an aperture, as a lozenge. I mean, sort of Sarah Kent also described it in many different ways.
Yeah, she saw it as a porthole, actually, I think, for, like you were inside a rotting ship somewhere.
Also looking out.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
That's another version.
Yeah. And the more recent paintings have this, because both of this, what they have in common, or one thing they have in common, is the sort of slightly bluish substrate, sort of, but with the more recent painting, you have like this sort of silver paint element, which is that sort of fairly new thing.
No, I use metallics, well, off and on, been quite a while now. In the early, well, what was it, maybe late 90s, there was a lot of paintings using gold, and then, I don't know, and then silver, and I've returned to silver recently. There's something very kind of implacable about metallic paint, which you can't kind of get past, and it has this extraordinary, because of its reflective qualities, the way that it changes in artificial light and becomes completely reflective, so it reverses any kind of tonal or hue values that you've set up. It changes them completely when you turn the lights on, and I kind of like that very double-edged sort of experience that's made possible by that.
And what's the thinking of starting to use metallic colours? I'm trying to work out whether it relates more to kind of like Frank Stella's sort of aluminium paintings, or there's an exhibition I think at the National Gallery at the moment about gold, for example, the use of gold in painting, and I thought, it's interesting, because you'd never think that you using metallic is like that kind of use of metallic paint, of sort of gold or silver in painting, sort of, is it anywhere near that, or is it sort of nothing to do with that kind of use of I'm thinking of almost like the ecclesiastical sort of element.
Oh, okay. So medieval painting, like gold leaf stuff. Icons. Well, there's that thing with icons that they're confrontational. They're not a window through onto another world. They're a kind of presence, aren't they? Which you can't kind of get past, or you have to deal with somehow in order to engage with it. So maybe there's something of that. I don't really know. I haven't thought of that. I mean, when I've been, because I'm not using metallics exclusively now, which I was at one point, then I just see it as another kind of facet of that's available for expressive terms.
And what's next?
Okay, the paintings I'm working on at the moment. The paintings I'm working on, I've become, maybe it's age or something, but I'm kind of hankering after the more naturalistic, almost landscape kind of qualities that I had in those 80s paintings. And something which is less definable. And I think these are very forthright, and obviously they engage with illusion and modelling and so on, as well as kind of hard edge, confrontational areas. But I suppose I'm thinking of something more atmospheric and less kind of less tangible, and to try and find a way of using that, but in conjunction with this very clear hard edge quality, which is these paintings have. I have actually made a couple of paintings that I think managed to do that, but it's early days. And
are you referring almost like a return, not necessarily in medium or execution, but to the Dharma varnish paintings? Or
Well, that's what I'm referring to, yeah,
right.
but I don't know.
But not made with...
no, at the moment
okay.
we're still acrylic, yeah. Who knows? Who knows what the future will bring?
Maybe at that point, that's quite a good point for any questions that could open up to the floor. Yeah.
I'm quite interested in how much preparatory work goes into sort of arriving at a painting like this. Do you make sort of small drawings?
I do make small paintings. I also make drawings, but I would say they're independent. Well, there are 2 drawings actually in the show, but they're made alongside the paintings rather than being preparatory in the kind of orthodox sense. Improvisation is really, really important for me. So when I start any of these paintings, I'll have only the very simplest idea. Okay, maybe this is going to be, a painting with a central thing, or maybe it's going to be a motif thing, and I just start painting, and then see where that takes me. And even if I've got this very simple idea, even that can change halfway along, just depending on what happens with in the course of painting.
They're more evolved on canvas.
Everything's evolved on canvas, and when I make drawings, I'm making drawings which, they use the same motifs, but I'm not trying to really develop. I'm not trying to let the idea develop on paper before I transfer it onto canvas, which I know most people work that way, but I just see them as kind of equivalent activities rather than one before the other sort of thing.
I think that is a very sort of old visual decision, that white. Was that quite a sort of spontaneous? When did you know you were going to do that? Was that sort of towards the end, or did you know?
I'm trying to remember. I think at the very beginning of this painting, it was probably completely different painting, but that probably only lasted for a short length of time. And then after that, once I determined that it was going to be, one of these kind of vortex or whirlpool paintings, it was a matter of using a lot of colour combinations until it came right. I mean, I've actually got photographs of this at different stages, and it's quite fascinating really, because at one point the whole thing was dark blue, which you can see remnants of now, but the whole look of it was like that. But once it had got to that point, then the essential composition stayed the same. But what might differ is, whether at what point, because these flat hard edge areas are poured, so they're not painted, they're taped and then poured in whichever direction they need to be. But then this, the graining brush can, at this point it looks as if it's going over the top of this, but once you get to the white, you realise that the white is poured over the top of that. So, those things can alter. That's particularly apparent in that painting, actually, because you can see it's coming up to the edge of those forms, so that it appears to be the red marks appear to be behind the forms, and sometimes they appear to be in front of the forms. So. Again, that's a kind of something that can alter at will, really, and that's purely kind of instinctive in the middle of the process of painting. You just get lost in it. Is that the right word? I don't know if lost is the right word, but anyway, yeah.
Are you looking to sort of contradict this sort of figure and ground sort of illusion? There's the white. Someone described it as a corpse hole, but it's actually not something that you look through, it's on the surface.
Yes, there were a number of paintings in, say, the mid-90s, in which the ground actually was the form. So there's like a flat ground. I mean, in these, the ground is all sorts of things. But in those paintings, there was a flat coloured ground, and then the brushstrokes over the top of that would define areas which became the positive forms. So those flat areas were actually operating as figure, but in actual fact were the ground. Yeah. So I want that. Yes, I'm trying to.
I also think that black, because it's matte, it looks like it should be further away, but you have it right on top.
Yeah.
Tim, have you seen the Cooning show?
I still haven't actually. Oh God!
Well, it's been extended.
Everybody has it.
Yeah, it's been extended because it actually finishes
the other
today.
day that it was.
By the way, it finished it, but it's been extended.
Yeah.
But again, with his paintings, the late paintings, I found something similar. That what you normally would read as the back, the white, in many areas is this process of like revising the painting and painting the white on top, which you would expect to be the background.
Yeah.
It keeps cutting and revising it. So.
Yeah. I need to go and have a look at those because I still have a problem with them, those late paintings. I know everybody else has been converting to them and
Problem not in a good way. Problem. Did you see them? Because they were shown in London.
I have seen
before.
Yeah, I have seen paintings from that period.
95 or something.
It's quite a while since.
I'm interested in the way the paintings are very physical. I mean, even with the title, one foot on the black and the other on the train, is that the whole title? Or is that part of it? But I mean, that kind of. So, how in that title do you think that kind of links to the way you like to make the paintings? Is there a kind of very physical sense of process in the way you orchestrate yourself, I suppose, is what I'm asking?
Yeah, well, I hope there is because there are different degrees of levels of physicality. Obviously, the poured areas are much more solid. Some of the brushed areas are quite thin, but I mean, there's not a huge amount of physicality, compared to, I don't know, well, quite a lot of people like Alexis Harding or Bram Bogart, somebody like that, where you get this huge, massively physical sort of thing.
But they look very physical, don't they? Your mindset must have to be a certain place to kind of do it. Otherwise, it's
Well, I would hope that they're physical enough or appear physical enough to operate in the way that I want them to operate, or to have this range of sensibility emanating from the degrees of physicality in them. But maybe they should be thicker and thinner. In all the work, I hope there's a kind of sense of trying to include polarities. That it's got thin and thick, but maybe the thick should be thicker.
So I'm just trying to push you in a slightly physical position to kind of take it a little bit. That's what I'm trying to say. It's how do you kind of, because they seem connected to that kind of Zen thing, or that sort of one shot or horsehair. I'm not saying but that kind of, how do you, that's what I'm trying to, this physicality of your position in making it.
How do I paint physically? They're both. So the poured elements are all done on the floor, and the brushed elements are all done on the wall. It's as simple as that, really. The kind of the obvious evidence of gravity indicates, the poured elements actually, I'm pouring it flat and then I'm manipulating it, and then I'll put it, when it gets to where I want it to be, then I flatten it, let it, and then it has to dry. So the drips go pretty much controlled, really, you don't want too much control, do you? I mean, you want enough control, but not too much.
Tim, you said that you made an orange ground that was really incredible and blue brush over it, and you had to reconcile yourself to the fact that you made a painting in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Can you tell us how you did that? How did that go?
Well, the paintings before that, which you probably remember, the ones in the 80s, with oil paint, took months to paint. Layer on layer and on and on and on. You'd be taking off as much as you're putting on. And obviously that had progressed from... at college I used acrylic paint. A lot of us did, actually. Very few people used oil paint at that point, it seems to remember. That was pretty dreadful acrylic paint. We used to make our own from PVA mixed with pigment, pretty cheap, because nobody could afford Aquatec. And that was the only good acrylic paint that existed. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. So, working with acrylic paint until the late 70s, and then getting involved with oil paint, and so the paintings took longer and longer to make, and so this shift of suddenly, okay, instead of sizing, then priming, then and then layering, suddenly I'm doing, okay, that was quick. I managed to prime this canvas with an orange ground. Probably had 2 coats and would have taken me maybe an hour or something max. And then I did this thing on top, and then I'd forgotten that kind of the intensity of acrylic, flat acrylic colour, and what that kind of feels like. And there's something incredibly, it was nostalgic for me in one sense, but also felt very kind of the moment. I mean, it did take me back to college actually, and just the kind of something in the air in the 60s really sort of, how corny does this sound? But it's true, and there was a kind of there was a freshness about that sensation, that colour sensation, a freshness to it, and vibrancy that kind of blew me away at the time. Actually, I didn't quite know how to deal with it.
These paintings seem to have a historic kind of episode, but although they're made in acrylic, they have the sort of sensibility of oil painting sometimes, and you discover them as you make them.
Yeah.
But when you're making the pure acrylic paintings, I just was interested in the phrase that you have to reconcile yourself with the fact that you've made a painting in 5 minutes. And it takes this journey, this experience, this physicality away, but maybe is a better piece of work at the end. Those kind of things that are thrown up to people in studios all the time, and how complicated that is. And I just thought your choice of language was really interesting, and you just sort of go out and run around.
Yeah, well, I suppose it was just such a shock. It was like,
I think there's a Barnett Newman painting, one of the first sort of sit paintings, where he placed the tape, and he felt it so perfect that he just left it as the tape rather than make the painting. So it sort of sounds similar sort of.
It was kind of like that, yeah, definitely. Because I'd started it thinking this is the beginning, and it would go on and on and on and on and on. Oh, it's finished. Difficult. And then, these are a lot, that's quite a long time ago now, so hopefully still retain that kind of freshness that I was talking about. I hope.
Yeah, definitely, but you can see the experience.
Yeah, I mean, I've just realised it's quite a strange thing, because I'm staring at that painting and I'm relating to that one all the time that I'm talking, whereas you're looking at that one.
We should have had 2 halves. So, any more questions? Otherwise, I think we'll clear the...
One more question. The grain brush, is this sometimes loaded with more than one colour, or is it go one colour on top of another, like the black and the green?
There's only one colour at a time on the brush, and where it looks like there are two colours, it's probably running either tracking a colour beneath, tracking a colour next to it, or going over a colour that's below it.
Right.
Yeah.
This week you went talk about Zen Buddhism and your experience in Zen Buddhism.
I shouldn't have even mentioned it.
This painting to me reminds me of when you do the mandala and then you scrape it off. It's like the process of destroying what beautiful piece of work. That just reminds me of the mandala being wiped away, washed away, brush marks, because there's more than one Buddhist monk that brushes the
except I haven't got the nerve to destroy it.
So
maybe one day.
Is it like a memory which is there and you've seen it before and you've just created it, do you think?
What in relation to mandalas, I mean? I've seen lots of mandalas, and there is something fascinating about them. I mean, I haven't got time, but the one thing that fascinates me about them is in both cultures, actually, whether Indian or Tibetan, is the kind of symmetry, the way that symmetry operates in them. Symmetry, I think, in Western art is quite difficult. It's often kind of boring, and I think when I use symmetry, I have to feel that there's something in there that is going to pull the rug out from underneath it at the same time.
Like that little bit here.
This thing at the side, which actually Matt Collins does mention it in that, which is interesting because although I've been doing this for quite a while, using that kind of thing at the side, which is a flip to what's in the centre, I hadn't really, I kind of thought about it in relation to the horizon line and so on, but hadn't really gone into it in any, really thought about what it might mean. I think we're done now.
I think we'll clear the chairs and have a look at the paintings. Thank you very much. Thank you. By the way, I picked up your tea.
Oh, good.